Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 96. Well, stay tuned for some more Kingdom Prologue this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and looking forward to our discussion this week. How are you liking our new setup in terms of the technology?
It's nice. I hope that our listeners can notice a difference in the sound quality, but we're trying to improve it as we go.
Yeah, we're using some new software this week, so hopefully everything sounds much cleaner and crisper. I will just briefly run through our regular housekeeping, and that is that we have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. If you wouldn't mind, we would sure appreciate a 5-star rating on iTunes, and we would love it if you would subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you listen to it, whether that's a podcatching app on your smartphone or some other device. Both of those things help boost our visibility to others as they are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the cost of hosting the audio files each month, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and any amount that you can give is much appreciated and very encouraging to us. Also, don't forget, this is episode 96, so we are rapidly closing in on episode 100, and you're not going to want to miss that. So, having said all of that, Todd, would you like to give us a running start at this week's material?
Yeah, we're going to do something a little different this time, because towards the end of the section that we are going over, Kline repeats himself somewhat. He goes over some of the things that he already had gone over earlier concerning the patriarchal authority and the family structure. So what we're going to do, because we're going to save the really interesting stuff for the end, some of the more controversial stuff here, we're just going to go over from the end of the chapter and work our way back and to get to that. So for those of you who are actually going have your Kingdom Prologue in front of you, we're on page 367, where Kline is teaching on the patriarchal authority. And he notes, and again, these are things that we've covered earlier, that during this time with Abraham as the patriarchal leader, there was still no priesthood. And so the authority in the church, the authority in the covenant community, was a family authority. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they were fathers, and they were heads of their family and the covenant community. And Kline notes how we just see that throughout the whole second half of Genesis with the patriarchs. Jacob is the one instructing his household that they should serve the Lord. The patriarchs are pronouncing benedictions. They act in a sense as prophets, priests, and kings. And so the patriarchs in Psalm 105:15 are called prophets. They spoke for the Lord. They gave prophetic utterances and benedictions. The Lord appears to both to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and speaks to them. Genesis 49, we have those covenant blessings from Jacob and curses. And we have the priestly intercession of Abraham. Here he's acting as a priest. And so the head of the clan, in a sense, the head of the covenant community, was the father, and he also acted in all these roles. Sometimes they're kings, sometimes they're prophets, sometimes they're priests. And all those will be separated, of course, at the intrusion that is the nation Israel. Now these functions will be taken out of the family, in a sense, And you will have prophets to the nation, priests to the nation, over all the nation, and then kings. There'll still be a family connection in some sense, because kings will run along a certain familial line as well as the priests. But here, the patriarchs, in a very unique way, are types of Christ in their prophetic and kingly and priestly callings as head of the Old Testament church. There's probably not a lot as far as application to our times, as much as just recognizing that is unique for these times. Any other thoughts on that?
Not really. I mean, it really does feel like familiar territory. This was the kind of stuff we were talking about when we were talking about them worshiping around altars. So I don't have a whole lot of insight to add here.
Okay, let's go back then to page 365. And again, he's going to talk more about family and covenant, how the government was, well, how it operated. And I recognize we've picked up some new listeners, so there may be some who don't remember that we've gone over this. But for those who have, you'll remember that the family and covenant lines are almost exact. In other words, Kline notes there are very few believers outside of the covenant line. He lists Melchizedek and Job as a few in the Old Covenant, but it's rare, those are rare exceptions. Normally, election occurs within the covenant line of Abraham's family, etc. And by the time we get to the 12 tribes, there's almost no one outside the covenant line, and the few that are, like Rahab, they join the covenant community. And so almost all the elect that we read about are within the covenant community family promise lines through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he notes that just like Noah, the covenant of grace would run through a family line, just like Noah spoke about Shem. And so, like Noah, Abraham would pass through a pre-kingdom stage before receiving the intrusion of judgment that would give him the promise. And Noah went through the same thing. He preached and he was persecuted for years. He passed through that pre-kingdom stage, and then you had the judgment of the flood, just like Abraham would wait, and the patriarchs would all wait until the judgment on Egypt and bringing them to the promised land, and then, of course, the judgment on the Canaanites. And so you have this progression from the pre-kingdom household of Abraham, starting with one man, his family, then branching off into 12 tribes. By the end of Genesis, we've seen this branch out to 12 sons of Abraham's as leaders of the tribes. And then we work from the old covenant to the new covenant, as that branches out from the nation Israel to Jew and Gentile, of course, in the covenant community together in Christ. And then he notes, of course, in the new heavens and earth, there will be no more earthly family. It'll simply be the elect, the heavenly family. So this progression from the old covenant, even within the old covenant, of a branching out, starts with Abraham, one man, branches out. We end with 12, we go to 12 tribes. Then we go to Jew and Gentile in the new covenant. And then finally to all the redeemed throughout history, from Adam and Eve on, in the heavenly city. And that's sort of the way the Bible moves from one, just like with Adam, and branches out. Abraham then, in the New Testament, becomes the father of us all. And Kline notes that when the New Testament speaks of Abraham as the father, it's speaking of the second level of fulfillment of the promises. He's not the father only of the Jews. It wouldn't make sense to say he's the father of us all for those who aren't Jewish.
Right.
But in Christ, he is the father of us all, because we are the spiritual seed, the offspring of Abraham, those who are, we receive the promises as Christ came from him and then saved Jew and Gentile in Christ. So in that sense, Abraham is our father. That old song for kids is true. Father Abraham had many sons, and we are one of them. So let's all no. So then Abraham, Kline notes, becomes a type of Christ because he becomes the father of a new mankind. So in a sense, he's a new Adam. Because the world, after Adam fell, we have these Adam-like figures like Noah and then Abraham. Abraham is the father of a new mankind. He's the father of those in faith. So he's only a type. He's not an actual covenant head in any real representative sense, but he is a picture of one. And Kline notes that as out of the deadness of loins, and of course it's Abraham was as good as dead. He couldn't have children. And so out of the deadness of those loins, a covenant family sprung. That would be a picture that out of the cross, of the death of Christ, the true church sprung, the family of God. And Kline wants to make that connection, that we see the typology with the old covenant members, those that pictured the church arising out of death, just like we arise out of the death of Christ. That's a beautiful picture when you put that all together, don't you think?
It really is. I mean, we've talked in recent episodes about how it was in spite of Abraham's works that God did accomplish his promise to Abraham. But I mean, that's a new level of richness there with what Kline did with death, because now what you see in the cross is that Jesus wins by losing, which is so counterintuitive. You would expect God's champion to come in with, the biggest sword out of everybody and just slay all the enemies and, make Conan the Barbarian look like a little weakling. But that's not how God's champion does it. I mean, he lays down his life in what the world counts as weakness, and that's exactly how he wins, and that's exactly where and when he wins. So it's interesting that Kline goes to the deadness of Abraham's loins and says that's where God's going to accomplish his promise, right there.
Yeah, and many theologians have even gone back and seen that with Abraham and even with Adam in the way Eve was created. That Adam is in a death-like sleep. I mean, he would have to be for that to happen out of his side. And then his wife appears. And so from her side, so there's some typology theologians have seen with us, from the death of Christ, we are his bride.
Interesting.
So there's always a way to take typology too far, but I think that theme, we see it enough throughout the Old Testament we're not going too far, I don't think, to see that. I don't think we're in full origin mode here.
Right.
Simply noting these things. Well, that brings us back, as we're moving backwards, to page 361, family polity. And this is one of the two areas where there is some controversy, and not only between us and, let's say, Baptists, but even among the Reformed on how to understand infant baptism. And so he starts with a continuity with the pre-flood, that the family was the Old Testament church. And circumcision then in the Old Covenant, it honors this family structure that obviously you're circumcising your own son. So right away you see that the covenant continues in the family relationship from father to children. So in circumcision, and of course in the Old Covenant, you have men representing women. The male circumcision, the whole family was set apart for God. And so you see in the Old Covenant that you have election. Abraham is elected, and then his family through circumcision is set apart for God. And those under the family authority structure are incorporated into the Old Covenant congregation. They are Israelites. And that was the formal entrance into covenant community was circumcision. And so Kline points out in Romans 11, the root is the physical family of Abraham. And so we're showing that covenant was coextensive at this time with family, that Abraham's offspring is the covenant community. But then Kline says that principle has not changed in the New Testament. In Ephesians 6, the children of the believers are instructed. They're addressed. Now, we don't know, nor did Paul, whether they were all elect or not. But they are instructed as members of the covenant community to obey their parents, to follow the word of God. So Kline would note that principle we see in 1 Corinthians 7:14, that the children of believers, or even one believer of the two, are holy. They're set apart, just like Abraham's children in the covenant community. And that would explain, of course, the household baptisms in the book of Acts. It would be an odd assumption that none of these households had young children or babies in them, because that's just what we're used to seeing throughout the Old Testament. And so covenant election do not coincide in the new covenant, Kline points out, just like in the old covenant. Just because you were part of the covenant community didn't mean you were elect. And of course, being baptized into the covenant community in the new covenant does not assume or mean you're elect. And Kline points out in Romans 9-11, not all Israel is Israel. Not only was that true in the Old Testament, but then he turns around and says, and now you Gentiles, if you're arrogant, you can be cut off. He uses the same language of Old Testament being cut off. And so the covenant principle that we should not try to make everyone in the covenant assume or that they're coextensive with being elect, that principle of the inner circle and then the wider circle of the covenant community continues on. And now here's where it gets problematic, even among the Reformed, because Kline will argue, and he does this obviously in his other books, where he spends more time on this, that infant baptism is not based on some promise in the Bible that God will save your children, but on the authority principle that started with Abraham and simply continues on into the New Testament. So there's no promise in the Bible that we baptize our children because God is going to save them, or he saves them at baptism. We baptize our children the same reason Abraham circumcised his children, because he was commanded to, as the head of the home, that those under his authority should receive the sign and that they would be given the privileges of being part of the covenant community, as well as the responsibility to grow up and to believe the promises in that community, in the word. And so often, and of course, you know, this is where there's tension. Sometimes Reformed people will say we base the infant baptism on a promise, but it's never quite clear because we know they're not all going to be saved. But what exactly is the promise?
Right.
And Kline would simply say that's a wrong way to explain it. The right way to explain it from the Bible is the authority principle continues, but there's no presumption or assumption of election or non-election. We certainly treat them as a part of the covenant community, and like anyone else in the covenant community, until they deny the faith and turn away, we would not assume they're not Christians. But we don't baptize on the basis of any type of presumption of election. That's a different principle. Now, I think you're with me on this. When you first came to this point of understanding what Kline is saying, how did it help you?
Well, it helped me a lot just in I was hearing all kinds of counter arguments from the Baptist side, from friends, as I was heading into this. And so to just take those objections off the table was a huge help to begin with. But this ties in so well with, you mentioned Romans 11, And that really impressed me too, the way that Kline worked that into this argument for infant baptism, because he opened to that and he said, look, Paul is saying, don't think that just because you are a baptized member of the new covenant that you can relax in the sense of be a hypocrite and still make it through the final judgment. He said, even in the new covenant, Paul is saying, don't get cocky, you Gentiles who have been grafted into this one covenant tree, because even you can be pruned off for unbelief. And that really, in my mind, sealed the deal, because a lot of my Reformed Baptist friends were arguing that I'm trying to reconstruct the argument in my mind now, but
yeah, I'm trying to, because I have that same issue because the Baptists will raise objections that they're right, because we're often so confused in the way we explain it. Well, for example, our children are in the covenant, and then they ask, well, are they in the covenant of grace? Yes. So they're saved? Not necessarily. But I thought the covenant of grace is between God and the elect. Well, they're in the covenant of grace. I mean, it comes across as really confused.
Yes.
Instead of simply saying that they are members of the covenant community where the covenant is administered, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're elect.
Right.
So the principle is the same. I think that's a lot easier than some of the more confusing language of promise. And then they say, well, what exactly is being promised? Well, God will be their God. Well, does that mean he'll save them? Not necessarily. So what does it mean? Now, we would say he is their God in a sense that he's God over the covenant community. He's given them these blessings,
mm-hmm.
and he's blessed them greatly. And so it's a unique blessing from God of love, but we have to separate that from the saving promises that are only received by faith and not by baptism.
Right. And that helped clarify my thinking where I was going with that, because the Baptist does want to say that the new covenant membership is only the elect. So,
right.
Obviously, if anyone is a member of the new covenant, they're elect. And what I think Paul is doing in Romans 11 really causes a problem for that perspective, because you've got, if all members of the new covenant are elect, you've got elect people being pruned off of this covenant tree for unbelief. And that seems like a real problem. Yes.
And I think that's probably one of the clearest places that we see this principle of the outer circle and inner circle, that there still is a covenant community. And if there still is, we should expect the children to be part of it the same way they always were, without anything telling us in the new covenant that principle is changed. That certainly would be expected from all the believers, the Jewish believers in the new covenant. And that's why we see that principle continue for more than 1,000 years in the church.
Right.
It was that they saw the same continuity. So it should be interesting what kind of thoughts this brings about in our listeners. But I think Kline's view of baptism, his explanation to me, is the most helpful.
We'll probably get lots of love mail for that.
I'm sure you will. Now that brings us, speaking of love mail, that brings us to the beginning of our section. This is probably where there's more controversy. And that is starting page 356. Because Kline begins by pointing out that the kingdom was promised to patriarchs, but it was not possessed until the generation after Moses.
Right.
When they actually entered the land. That's why his book is called Kingdom Prologue, because everything up till the end of his book, which is the patriarchal era, is a prologue to actually inheriting the kingdom. So Kline begins by noting that their situation is the same as ours. We've been promised the new heavens and earth, the meek shall inherit the earth, and yet we still have not possessed it yet. The earth does not belong to us. And so we live in the same situation. So we can learn from how the patriarchs existed in a common grace fallen world where they've been promised the land but not given it to them yet. How did they exist? And then we learn how do we exist then? And so he starts off by noting in Genesis 13:17, the Lord instructs Abraham to walk the land. And Kline points out normally that would be the way that you would stake out a claim.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sort of like the old Oklahoma rush where they would put down the flag and say, this is mine.
That's right.
And yet he's not putting down any flags in a sense. The land isn't really in his possession yet. He is an alien and a stranger in the land. And so it's the walk of faith, in other words, to look at what God will give your descendants in the future and to believe. And even the way the few portions of the land that were purchased in the life of the patriarchs, especially that whole section where Abraham buys the field to bury Sarah. And eventually, of course, he'll be buried there. The cave of Machpelah. There's a transaction where Abraham has to purchase the land. And it's odd that as you're reading that, you have to remember God already said, I'm giving you this land.
Right.
And yet at the same time, he's wheeling and dealing and he has to purchase it because he's recognizing, he doesn't instruct them to give him the land because it's God's. He doesn't say every inch of this land is mine, says the Lord. I'm quoting here. He realizes that it's a promise that is not yet fulfilled. And so he has to humbly respect who owns the land at this time. And that promise will only be fulfilled by an intrusion, by a judgment that God will bring about. It will not be about Abraham demanding it or claiming it for himself. And so he purchases the land in the way you were supposed to buy land at that time. And at the end of Genesis, Kline points out that they're still not in Canaan. And at the end of Genesis, the possession of the land is even in worse shape, it seems, at the beginning, because God's people are about to starve, it looks like. And so at the end of Genesis, they have to leave the land. And so nothing really happens in the whole patriarchal period where God actually gives them what he promised. They have to wait. They're sojourners and they're content with their status as sojourners, Kline points out. They understand that this is going to happen in the future and they live by faith in a foreign land. And so Kline points out what we see here then is cooperation with the peoples of the land, waiting for that redemptive judgment.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, doesn't that sound familiar? And so Kline notes as we move on that we see that in the way that there are covenants between God's people and the pagan nations and the peoples, which should strike you as odd because when we get to them, the conquest, God instructs the people, do not make any covenants with those who are in the land now. Do not have any dealings or covenants with the Canaanites. They are set apart for destruction. And yet in this phase, they're making covenants and they're having dealings all the time. And so in a theocracy, there is no covenant. It's ruled by God alone, and God decides who belongs there. Only those who are idolaters are kicked out or destroyed. So a theocracy is not for a common grace setting, is Kline's point.
Mm-hmm.
The patriarchal period is a non-theocratic time where they are working for the common good. In the political realm, they are not making demands. They are not claiming from the Bible, from what the prophecies they've heard, that this land belongs to them. They are doing their best to live in harmony with their neighbors and even help them out at times, that we'll look at in a moment. So before we move to that, what are your thoughts?
That our listeners should send their love mail to glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com, and that this just underscores the gracious nature of the Abrahamic covenant and you've mentioned theocratic or works nature of the Mosaic covenant. Because you're right, Abraham and his descendants are entering into these covenants with these Canaanites with not even commentary on it, let alone condemnation from God, whereas he explicitly instructs Israel in the Mosaic covenant not to have any such covenants with the Canaanites.
Yeah, and I would suspect from what you just said that if we have any theonomic listeners, that they're not telling anybody they listen. So,
closet listeners.
We may not get any mail.
Right.
So Kline goes on to point out some examples of these covenant arrangements. There were covenants over the wells, who could drink from what well, and there were agreements with the pagan communities. They were tolerated as sojourners in the land, Abraham's family. They weren't treated as if they were a nation of themselves. They were tolerated, but they were not possessors. They possessed very little. Like I said, a well here and there, but they were always traveling around and, as you said, building altars and moving on. In Genesis 14, we have this military alliance with, of all cities, Sodom. So Sodom, that would later be set apart for destruction, now is in alliance with God's people, and not even against Canaan, who God promised he would curse, but a common enemy of the area, of the land. So now we have a military alliance, a believing community and unbelieving community working together for the common good. Abraham, after that, wants the Ammonite fighters to receive their just portion. He doesn't treat them as any less because they're unbelievers fighting for the same cause. And again, Kline points out, when they purchase the cave, etc., it's not a divine right they demand. By paying, they admit that God's promised land is right now rightly under Canaanite control. There is no plan for it slowly to be under Abraham's control. So Abraham understood that by paying, he's rendering unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's. They rightly were leaders, and he honored that. Kline also points out, this is interesting, that Jacob denounces his son's violence against certain Canaanites. Remember when, because of the what happened to one of the women, Jacob denounces the sons had killed many of them with the trick of the circumcision, and then Jacob denounces that when later on God would command it.
Right. And
so Jacob understood it wasn't time for violence against the enemies of God. God would bring that in his time. But until he commanded it, it was not a time to render judgment. And so Kline points out, it's not for pilgrims to change times. We do not usher in a theocracy early. We wait for God to bring it about the way he will. And that's always through an intrusive judgment. And so the time of the patriarchs, like our time, is a time of perseverance in faith and patience in tribulation, and working alongside unbelievers to further the cultural mandate. The covenant of grace should only be believers working with believers to grow the church, the kingdom of God. But the kingdom of man is something we work together with unbelievers to make things as good as we can, but we work together. Kline points out some examples of how God's people in those days blessed unbelievers. Genesis 14 again with the war and saving many of the pagan cities from destruction. Jacob, even with Laban's sheep, how Jacob helped Laban. Joseph in Egypt, obviously. Think what a blessing Joseph was to that pagan nation and all their idolatry.
Right.
Here he is in the midst of them, helping them. And then, even at the end of Genesis chapter 47, it says, Jacob blesses Pharaoh in verse 7, which would really strike the reader when we think ahead of Moses. Moses would not bless Pharaoh, would he?
Not quite.
Now that the intrusion has arrived, the redemptive judgment has arrived, there is no working with Pharaoh. There's no blessing him. It's curse time. And yet, right at the end of Genesis, chapter 47, we have Jacob blessing a pagan leader who's promoting idolatry and et cetera, et cetera. And that should really give us pause when we start bringing our Christian politics and theocratic thinking into the New Covenant era. And I'm always blessed by reading the early church, some of the prayers for even some of the emperors who were persecuting Christians. They would pray for the emperor's blessing and protection. And they got it. They understood that we are pilgrims again. And only God could bring in judgment in his time. But right now we are to be a blessing.
Right.
And there are a lot of ramifications for this, but I'll let you go with a few.
Well, I mean, the main one that just stands out is what I just said at the last time we paused, which is what a contrast between this Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. Yeah, I mean, you would not find Moses blessing the Pharaoh. In fact, I mean, as Exodus begins, you have this foreboding sense that the tides have really turned, that the new Pharaoh doesn't remember Joseph, and things are going to be different now. But yeah, I mean, even entering into military alliance, wow, that would be completely unthinkable for Israel to enter into military alliance with anyone living in the land of Canaan.
Right, and we really have to make distinctions because you have, those who are really strong Kuyperians and even more so theonomists who they want to emphasize, well, Christ is the Lord of all.
Right.
And of course, that's true, but how he exercises his lordship is very different in different circumstances. That doesn't assume, just because Christ is the Lord of all, that we have a right to promote a theocracy or to expect people to bow before God's laws in the Bible and that we should punish heretics, etc. Christ was Lord over all, even as he was God over this era in Abraham's time.
Right.
And yet, because the Lord was the Lord over all, you don't see God's people trying to bring about a theocracy or making demands. You see them simply working for the common good. And you see them being a blessing. And really servants more than masters to their neighbors. And so we do further their cultural mandate in trying to promote the common good in any way we can. But not as sort of some demand that we're claiming lordship for Christ and bringing people under Christ's lordship through his law. That's not what Abraham was doing, is it?
Not at all, especially if he's wanting the Ammonite fighters to receive their just portion. That's absolutely a common grace principle and not something that you'd be finding as God is telling his people, cleanse this area to make it holy for me. So,
right. If we're going to cleanse politics for the Lord, then it would be sacrilegious to do what Jacob did, which was to pray God's blessings on Pharaoh.
Yes.
Can you imagine a king promoting such idolatry as the Egyptians did and all the awful things that went along with it? And here he is praying God's blessing on him.
Mm.
We would never be able to do that with a theonomic understanding of the church bringing all things under the lordship in this age that way. And yet we don't get any sense reading Genesis that what Jacob did was wrong.
No, there's no condemnation of that at all.
Now, there would have been in the theocracy, obviously. You would never bless a pagan ruler who tried to usurp. You would tell them that he's under God's curse.
Right.
And yet, so if we're going to study what is our political responsibility, what is our responsibility in this time, Kline would say, go to the patriarchs.
Yep.
Look at what they did. They were a blessing. They weren't retreatists. They were involved in military battles. They were involved in I guess what we could call politics. But they were very involved, but always for the common good and not under some type of mandate to bring them under the authority of the Bible. Unless they joined the covenant community as saved people.
Sure, that would be a different story.
Right. So the implication is we don't just study this section of the Bible for interest. We are learning how to live. We are learning how to live in a common grace situation as servants while maintaining our faith and not compromising our own obedience to God. And we see that in the life of the patriarchs.
So, yeah, we can learn a lot about how to love our neighbors and to be rightly engaged in the world around us, culturally, politically, otherwise. What's the prophetic chapter where we see something very similar? Is that Jeremiah 29?
Yes, Jeremiah 29.
Okay. So here in these latter chapters of Genesis, and then Jeremiah 29 would be, I mean, I guess I shouldn't have brought Jeremiah 29 in because that's exile, but here we're in Pilgrim territory before we've ever even officially entered the promised land.
Right. But you see the difference in how they were to live in exile outside the theocracy.
Yes.
They were to be a blessing to the people, and they were to work for the common good with them. Things that, again, the Israelites were told not to do with the Canaanites. So, all saying, if you want to look for a Christian politic, go to the patriarchs. Don't go to Israel first.
That's right.
Like you said, Israel is the parentheses. That is the unusual situation. That is an intrusion. That's picturing final judgment. Here we have the situation that matches ours with the patriarchs.
It's probably a
good place to stop. We were saying the same thing.
All right. Well, thank you, Todd. That was a really enjoyable discussion. And kind of worked the way Kline structured some of his sentences from, the end to the beginning.
It's like we read the Hebrew Bible.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week. You can email us your thoughts at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. And the podcast itself is at Glory Cloud Pod. And you can also join in the discussion at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen and they can get you added. And we will talk to you again next week.